I want to talk a little bit today about the path to unconventional leadership and tell you a story you may not have heard about. This Wednesday is the 27th anniversary of an event called Women and Girls in Sports Day. And that's right, that's worthy of applause. So this day honors female participation in athletics. And what many may not know is that the opportunity for women and girls in this country to participate in sports started with a woman that can be traced back to the late 1800s. And what few know is it began with this woman who was not the least bit athletic. This woman's name was Senda Berenson. She was a small woman with a heavy accent. She was a Jewish immigrant from Lithuania whose parents had brought her to Boston as a small child. She grew up, she wanted to be a painter or a dancer or pianist. But because of ill health, she wasn't able to do any of those things. So what she did was, in an effort to improve her strength and her health, she went to a school which was called the Boston Normal School of Gymnastics. There she trained in anatomy and in physiology and hygiene. And when she graduated, she was hired by a women's college in Massachusetts called Smith College. So here this small, sickly woman ended up being the head of the physical education department in Smith College in the late 1800s. She was in her early 20s. As she was doing her work there, she heard about this new game that had been developed in nearby Springfield, Massachusetts. It was a game called basketball. You may have heard of this. So she went over to check it out, and she watched, and of course it was all guys playing it, and she decided she might take a risk here, and she might take this game back to Smith College and develop a version for women to play. Now, sports in those days were considered too strenuous for women. Women were not encouraged to participate in sports. It was 1892, and competition was considered unladylike. So she based the women's team on cooperation and teamwork because she thought that would be better received. Men were banned from attending these games because it was considered unseemly for them to be able to witness women running around and perspiring. Now, mind you, you shouldn't have a hard time seeing why these women might be perspiring, given what they had to wear playing basketball. So despite their attire, this was an unexpected success, and the game that Senda developed quickly spread to other women's schools. And Senda went out of her way to reach out to black schools and to Native American colleges, and they in turn began developing teams and opened many doors for women. Some of the first women's games then started to be played on the West Coast. The very first game was between Cal and Stanford. And the women were incredibly excited to have this opportunity. At the end of the game, each of the women on the Stanford team was awarded a varsity letter. This was the last time women would be allowed to have a varsity letter for more than 80 years at Stanford. The university president, after the game, said he found women's participation in athletics unseemly. There's that word again. And the Stanford Faculty Athletic Committee then voted to abolish women's intercollegiate athletics. So meanwhile, over on the Cal campus, a vote was held among Cal's existing varsity lettermen, and they were all men, of course, at that time, to decide whether the Cal women who played should be awarded varsity letters, and they voted no. Within a few years, women's intercollegiate athletics at Cal came to an end as well. And there, too, it was not until the 1970s that the Cal women's basketball team finally achieved the varsity status that it had earned so many decades before. So why did things finally change for women in the 70s? In 1972, Congress passed Title IX. This was a bill that was sponsored by Senator Birch Bayh in the Senate and Representative Patsy Mink over in the House. It was a federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in any educational institution related to any activity that institution provides if that institution receives any federal funding. Now, for those of you under 50, and I see there are several of you, you may find this hard to believe, but in those days, women were not admitted to many colleges, and if they were admitted to university, it was even harder to get a job afterward. Math and engineering and science were pretty much off limits. Auto shop and sports, you can forget that. Girls could take dance, or they could take home ec, which was cooking and sewing class. You could go see your guidance counselor, who might advise you that if you wanted to try for a career path, you could potentially be a nurse or a teacher. But certainly you were not encouraged to be a doctor or a principal or a university president. There were literally separate pink and blue forms for vocational classes. And the tests, what we call SAT tests today, were notoriously gender biased, making it very hard for women to succeed. Women's schools in those days, private schools and women-only schools allowed some participation in sports, but public schools and parochial schools did not allow females to participate regardless of your talent or your interest. There were no such things as laws against sexual harassment. There was no concept called equal pay for equal work. Pregnant young women were forced to drop out of school, and pregnant teachers were forced to quit if they began to show. By banning sex discrimination in schools, and this was 1972, Title IX opened up a world of possibilities for women and girls. There is no denying this was landmark legislation. These 37 words: no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. That's the totality of that law. Those 37 words permanently altered the educational landscape for girls and women across the country. This law has had enormous and far-reaching effects. Today, over half college graduates are women, and in many graduate programs, more than half the students are women. And indeed, for me, my own leadership opportunities would likely never have happened were it not for Title IX. When Title IX was passed, I was in the 9th grade. I didn't know anything about this new law, and frankly, I didn't know anything about Congress at that time. I was just concerned about whether I could play, because the boys that I had grown up playing with were all getting to participate on these teams, and I was being told, no, that's the end, you need to go off and do other things now. I had tried out for the baseball team in junior high, and that was not very well received, and not a great experience. But the good news is, by the time I got to high school, they were starting to allow girls to play sports. So I got a chance to play several sports. The bad news is that we still had to wear kilts and pleated skirts in order to play. And not only in order to play field hockey, but to play basketball and softball as well. You can imagine how fun that was to play softball in a pleated jumper. We didn't have soccer then, but we had field hockey, and I loved the skill and stamina and teamwork of this sport. I was small, but I was fast, and I soon became a prolific scorer. With some prodding from my mother, when I graduated high school, I decided I wanted to go back to the University of Kansas. I had grown up in Kansas, and I still had an affinity, and its governor was different than its governor today. And I went back there, and when the coach back there of the field hockey team heard that I might be coming, it turned out not only did she want me on the team, she promised me to get me there that I could have the scholarship. And I say the scholarship, not a scholarship, because there was only one scholarship, and it was for the whole team, and it was worth $1,000. The woman who had it was a junior, and so the promise was when she graduated, then I could have the scholarship. So in those days, that was a big deal. So off I went, and in our first year, we had a great team. We won all sorts of tournaments, and we were doing very well. And then out of the blue, the university announced they were cutting all the women's teams, except for basketball, which you'll find ironic later. At this point, we hated the basketball team at the time because they were the only ones that kept getting funding, and we all got cut. So hold that thought until later in this story. So there we were told if we wanted to keep playing, we could, but there would be no university recognition, there'd be no funding, there'd be no support. We could hold bake sales or do whatever we wanted, but that was the end of that. And until this point, I'd not been active in government, in student organizing, in politics. I didn't pay attention to the law or what was happening in the world. I'd never done a media interview. I'd never held a press conference. I didn't know what the Board of Regents did. I'd never visited the state legislature. I had little grounding, but I had a lot of righteous indignation. So off I went to try to right this wrong, not knowing what I didn't know. I learned where budget decisions got made, who made them, how to testify at the Student Senate and the Board of Regents, how to get the attention of the university chancellor. Weeks turned into months. This was well before the era of the internet. It was well before the era of social media. So I decided to get attention by organizing a relay race where we had each female athlete run for a mile carrying a baton with a petition in it from the university campus to the state capitol in Topeka, which is about a half an hour away. And the next day, in the front page of the big daily paper, was a photo of me handing this petition to a female legislator who took up our cause and said she was going to change the university's state funding unless they got their act together. So all of a sudden, people started to pay attention. Now, in these days, women were not allowed in the NCAA. There was a separate organization called the AIW for women. So another big battle going on was whether men should be allowed to govern women's sports or whether women should have their own governing body. So, of course, I got involved in that, and our budget issue became front and center, and we began to get more and more attention. At the time, a professor came up to me, a woman who was a professor not having anything to do with athletics, but a professor of art and history, and she'd seen what was going on with the women's teams, and she came up and she said, "You should file a Title IX complaint." And I, of course, said, "What's Title IX?" And she, being a good teacher, said, "Why don't you go do some research? And then when you're done, come back and talk to me." So I did that, and I came back, and I got very excited, and she helped me file a Title IX complaint. I was 19 years old. This was 5 years after the law was passed, but the federal government still had not even bothered to adopt final regulations. They were not taking the law seriously, and it was not clear how or whether the law was even going to be enforced. As it turned out, my complaint was among the first in the country. It took several years of prodding to get the federal government and the university to act, and primarily because women athletes at the time were still the exception and football was still king. But the end result was a multi-part, multi-year, multi-million-dollar remediation plan that the university was required to implement to provide equity in funding and in facilities and training and medical care in all elements, all aspects of women's sports from then on. If you had asked me before this happened whether I planned to go to law school or become a student leader or get involved in public service, I would likely have said no. If you had asked me whether I even knew what I was getting into and whether I was confident we would be successful, I would have surely said no. But this unconventional leadership experience turned out to provide opportunities for women who attended the university and who attend to this day, and unbeknownst to me, changed my life as well. In my era, guidance counselors did not have professional sports team owner on the list for women to think about. Nor did they have on the career list things like judge or utility commissioner or deputy mayor. None of those things was I encouraged to do or even thought about doing. And certainly there was no career path that said helping LGBT people achieve full equality. So for me, for whatever reason, once the university took these actions, I reacted by figuring out a way to lead, using skills I didn't know I had, gaining strengths by aligning efforts with others, helping other women, and supporting each other. I learned the value of advocacy from within the system and advocacy from the outside. I saw that obstacles that seemed insurmountable were not always, in fact, insurmountable, and that sometimes you had to take a couple steps backward to move a step forward. I did not, however, learn that patience is a virtue. I failed in that. These formative leadership experiences set me on a path to public service and social justice advocacy work. They showed me it was okay to step up even when you're not sure what you're doing and that you're not sure whether you're going to be able to succeed, that you can tackle challenges in new ways, and that you can persevere even when you hear the limb being sawed off behind you when you've gone out too far. Over the years, because of what I went through there at the University of Kansas and what Title IX had done for young women such as me, I was able to then get involved in public service in many ways. I had the opportunity to direct several high-profile negotiations for the city, to lead systemic reforms on many fronts, whether it was protecting consumers when I was chair of the Utilities Commission and Enron was trying to deregulate the energy industry here, or when I was working to protect LGBT individuals or tackling other problems. We created, for example, the first ever Families in Education levy in the city of Seattle, and I was very proud to lead that team. When we had the first tent city ever in our community's history, spent months negotiating that was at the old Kingdom parking lot, and ended up turning that into the first transitional housing for the homeless in the country and the first transitional housing for women here in Seattle. Other opportunities came along. The downtown was struggling mightily in that era, and I had the opportunity to negotiate a number of complicated transactions to revitalize the downtown, to reform our finance and contracting systems for the city, to replace all of our old municipal buildings with a new campus, something that had been tried many times. And to get laws passed so that we could become the second city in the country to provide domestic partnerships for our employees, and then stop an attempted repeal of those. And then when I was on the bench, to create something that's called a mental health court. In those days we didn't have them. The idea was to help folks who are in the criminal justice system who have mental illness instead get taken out of the system and be connected with services, treatment, and housing. Along the way, I had a chance to work with others to found a nonprofit focused on child juvenile justice and child welfare reform, a school, middle school for girls, and many of you who grew up in my era know that middle schools for girls, when you're a girl, middle school was a very tough time, particularly if you cared about science, math, or leadership. So we formed a new school for girls of all incomes here in Seattle, not very far from where we are right now. And then I had the opportunity over the years to help lead several efforts for the LGBT community. We stopped an attempted repeal of our state's anti-discrimination law that had taken us 29 years to get passed. Those 4 words, sexual orientation and gender identity, it took us 29 years to get the legislature to. And in our state, we had a non-discrimination law starting in 1949. But it wasn't until 2006 we finally got those 4 words added. Then we had a domestic partnership law we got passed, and we had another attempted repeal of that law, and I was fortunate enough to be able to lead the statewide coalition to protect that law from getting repealed. And then our marriage equality law that you all, many in this room, participated in helping save when there was an attempted repeal last year. So coming full circle, along this road from SENDA to Title IX also ended up providing me an opportunity to bring the first women's professional basketball team to Seattle. This was called the Seattle Reign. It was the American Basketball League. And you'll appreciate that when the folks were starting this league, they had somehow heard about what I had done with regard to Title IX way back in Kansas and approached me and asked if I would help them. And so we got a team and we located here in Seattle. And that was our first professional basketball team in the state. Then 11 years later, another team with which you're familiar, the Seattle Storm, was threatened to be taken to Oklahoma with the Sonics. That was a group, Oklahoma businessmen, who were going to move both teams. And because of those opportunities I'd had, being a utility commissioner, being a judge, having worked on Title IX, all those things then came together, and I had the opportunity to put together an effort to go save that team. In that team, you may recall, won that little championship a few years ago. Girls growing up today will never understand why anyone would think that they shouldn't have the opportunity to study, to be doctors, to be scientists, to be judges, or to play sports. And boys, too, will never think that girls aren't able to do anything they dream of. After I led this effort to save the Storm, a season ticket holder came up to me, and she's a grandmother and runs a local nonprofit, and she said she'd been bringing her grandson to games for several years. She told me that her daughter shared a story with her where they were home and the living room TV was on, and he was watching an NBA game. And he called out and he said, "Come in the living room, come in the living room." She went in, she said, "What's wrong, what's wrong?" And he pointed at the TV and he said, "Look, look, boys can play basketball too." So for me, that's what it was all about. Because of Title IX, girls growing up today will grow up with so many more doors open to them, so many fewer barriers they have to transcend. They'll be able to play sports, become a scientist, become a university president, or indeed become a United States president. And they won't see this as in any way remarkable. And for this, we can thank SENDA, we can thank Title IX, and the many, many on whose shoulders we stand. As President Obama said when he announced the creation of the first ever White House Council for Women and Girls, it's up to us to carry this work forward to ensure that our daughters and our granddaughters have no limits on their dreams, no obstacles to their achievements, and that they have opportunities their mothers and grandmothers never dreamed of. Thank you.